SHC, spontaneous human combustion, sudden human cremation. A person becomes a pile of powder and leaves behind perhaps a partial leg or shrunken head amid combustibles that weirdly escape a fire that seems to be so fierce it exceeds what happens in a crematorium. Now, despite fascinating cases that span centuries, this haunting phenomenon is so bizarre, frightening, and opposed to common sense that its existence must be denied by mainstream fire science and medicine today. But one who does not deny, however, is Larry E. Arnold. He's the director of Parascience International. And after discovering the truly baffling burning of Dr. Bentley in 1975, he has traveled the world documenting this rare, but not impossible, enigma. Now, his groundbreaking research and controversial book, Ablaze, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion, it challenges the popular idea that SHC is crack pottery and a myth to be debunked. It takes curiosity, plus courage and thoughtfulness to delve into the high strangeness of SHC. Its exploration is indeed high adventure, one worthwhile to those who know that not everything is yet explained, that the real mysteries still exist. Now, Ablaze is available through Amazon and directly from Larry himself at parascience.com. I highly recommend this book. It's packed with tons of stuff. What led you to this?
What led us to this was reading a book when we were in junior high school by Frank Edwards called Stranger Than Science. It was a paperback. I think at that time it cost us 35 cents. And it had compilation of all kinds of weird stuff, 14 stuff as we call it today. And one chapter in Mr. Frank Edwards' book was called Incredible Cremations. And it dealt specifically with one lady who lived in St. Petersburg in 1951 who had an incredibly fiery fate that fit the definition of what Justin just described to you as the classic concept of spontaneous human combustion. And we never forgot about that. When we went through high school and then into college studying mechanical engineering, we talked to our professors about this and nobody had ever heard about it. And when we came out of college and had a shift in consciousness and a career change, we remembered back to that book that we read in junior high school, and lots of people at that time were looking into UFOs and cryptids, and those fields seemed to be fairly well represented, but we couldn't find anybody who was studying this thing called spontaneous human combustion. So we thought we'd go down to the Library of Congress, live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so it was not too long a commute down to DC, checked into the Library of Congress, and tried to find some books about SHC. Couldn't find any. We went next door to the newspaper archives section of the Library of Congress and tried to pull up some newspapers from St. Petersburg, Florida, Tampa, Florida in 1951 to see if anybody, any reporter, any credible news source had reported this alleged case of so-called spontaneous human combustion that afflicted Mary Hardy Reeser. And what we discovered was that Frank Edwards had not made up the story. This was front page news back in 1951 in the major newspapers on the west coast of Florida. And it dealt with a lady, as we later discovered, was actually a native of Pennsylvania. She grew up about 30 miles from where we're located here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And in fact, what's left of her is buried in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania at the West Chestnut Hill Cemetery, which is about 10 miles from where we live. So we're kind of in the locus of this very strange event that supposedly could not happen. What did happen to Mary Reeser on the morning of July 2, 1951, was that her body was found reduced to a pile of rubble consisting of a foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, part of tissue that was identified as part of her liver, and a head that was said by the local authorities at the time to have shrunken in size to a size of about a teacup grapefruit. All suggesting an incredibly hot, high temperature, long duration blaze. And yet surrounding combustibles in her apartment, aside from the chair in which she sat, piles of newspaper next to her, daybed linen and nearby, all of those escaped damage by what should have been an intensely fearsome blaze. Also, there was no odor of burned human flesh at the time. In fact, the first responders said it was kind of a sweet aroma in Mary's apartment. Local officials at the time were completely bumfuddled. They had never found or investigated a case like this, and they were quite mystified. At the time, a world-renowned forensic anthropologist, Dr. Walter Marion Krogman, was vacationing in St. Pete, Florida. He heard about the case and took a professional as well as a personal interest in this episode because he himself had conducted a number of experiments on the effects of fire on various types of tissue, including humans. And he wrote at the time that he couldn't explain this. It caused the hairs on the back of his neck to bristle and stand up. It was so frightening to him. He actually admitted in writing and later to us in person that had he not investigated this case firsthand, he would not have believed it. He would have called it impossible. He told us that in his experiments, in order to ashen a human body to the extent that was found in Mary Reese's apartment would require controlled scientific conditions and a fire that was in 12 hours in duration, reaching a temperature of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Incredibly high temperature, considering that lava that flows out of a volcano is usually about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So how can you have a fire that's supposedly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit burning for 12 hours in an apartment that shows no damage from heat or flame other than to the victim in the chair in which she sat?
Yeah, and speaking of that, I know you had sent me, a bunch of slides and a lot of really disturbing photographs. Are there any in particular, you know, as you're talking, and if you want me to show any particular slides, just let me know which title.
Yeah, you're welcome to show the slides. The ones that are titled Weiser would be a good place to start. Her tombstone is, as we said, about 10 miles from where we live, from where we're talking to you fine folks this evening, over in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, at the West Chestnut Hill Cemetery. We visited the tomb site. In fact, we've talked to relatives next of kin of Mary Weiser, and it's a common family lore in the Weiser family. Kind of fame that they didn't particularly want to have. But history says there's something very bizarre, quite inexplicable to this day. The Sarah Mary Hardy down in St. Pete the night of July 1st into the morning of July 2nd, 1951. She was last seen alive about 9 p.m. The evening of July 1st, in fact, by her son, who was a physician by trade. She'd taken 2 Seconal tablets, and it was rumored that she might take another 2 Seconal sleeping tablets that night before calling it a day. And the debunkers are quick to jump on that and saying that, well, she just simply fell asleep in a chair and dropped a cigarette in her lap, and overnight, poof, she became something that you normally can't reproduce in a crematorium retort. It's a nice fable, but it doesn't seem to work at all, as the debunkers, as the naysayers would like everyone to believe. This is Dr. Krogman, as we said, a world-famous forensic anthropologist in his day who had specialized in his career, among other things, of determining the effects of fire in various living tissues. We sat down with Dr. Krogman and reviewed the case with him with some reluctance, we might add. Initially, he didn't particularly want to recall the Mary Reeser case when we met with him in the 1970s, because a quarter century had elapsed by then, and this still clearly bothered him. What perplexed him at the time when he was in St. Pete doing his original investigation and inquiries into the Reeser case was, one, the extent of reduction to her body, which we've already described, the localization of the heat, which we've also addressed. The photo below him shows a morgue shot of what was literally shoveled out of Mary Reese's apartment. It's the 1 foot, the satin slipper that had encased that foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, as we said, and that ovoid mass in the top of photo above her foot is arguably her shrunken skull, which also concerned Dr. Krogman significantly. As we said, also, there was the absence of the noxious smell of burned flesh. And as Krogman said to us, this was an affront to common sense. Common sense as understood by firefighters in his day, and in fact to this day, as well as common sense to his medical professional practice of experimentation on various types of tissues. He didn't want to consider spontaneous human combustion, as he said it was monotonously consistent pattern, which also gives the lie to mere coincidence, because he thought at the time that history had presented several other cases that were comparable to what he himself was looking at with the Weiser case. She was burned so bad that she was nicknamed, as the caption says, Mary Weiser was known as the Cinder Woman. When we last spoke with the St. Pete Police Department back in 1995, the case, we were told, was still open at that time. They had not closed the case. This was some 50 years after Mary met her remarkable demise.
This was the case that brought this to the public, right? This
Yes.
was the,
Yes.
How do people react to this? I mean, did they ignore it? Like, was it covered by a lot of, news media at that time? Like, what was the general vibe?
At the time, this, as we said, was front page news in the St. Petersburg Times newspaper and the Tampa Tribune newspapers. Both newspapers covered the oddity of the fire. They quoted official investigators who were perplexed by what what confronted them when they arrived at Mrs. Reese's apartment that morning. We did supply with another graphic. We spoke to the police officer who was stationed as security at the front door of Mary Reese's apartment. This was Officer Tipton's first day on duty with the St. Pete Police Department. And he told us that as he secured the premises, he would watch and listen to other investigators enter and leave the site. And he said they were all mystified, all perplexed. They had no idea how to explain what they had just come from looking at. The other gentleman is Nelson Aders. He is one of the two firemen who actually helped to shovel up Mary's ashes from the apartment. And he acknowledged to us that as a professional firefighter, he had never been to a fire prior to or since responding to the Weiser scene that was anywhere emblematic, similar to this particular very bizarre fire fatality. He told us that in his view, Mary Weiser died by spontaneous human combustion, an astonishing admission by a professional firefighter. Here's a close-up of Mary's remains. She weighed about 175 pounds the evening of July 1st, 1951. The morning of July 2nd, what was shoveled out of her apartment, which included some springs from the chair in which she was known to be last seated, weighed about 8 pounds. A remarkable reduction of a human being.
But like, what was the public perception of this? Did they? I mean, apart from the people who investigated it, like, how did people respond to this? Were they just like, oh, this is just an anomaly? I mean, because we've never heard of this before? Or
yeah. As we've been able to look back at the historical record, the initial public response seemed to be one of great curiosity and reasonably high degree of interest. This was a mystery. This was a real life bona fide mystery that demanded some answers and raised a lot of questions. But what we've discovered in the decades that we've devoted to researching this phenomenon in general, after the initial curiosity wears off, people tend to want to forget about it. This is an incredibly mysterious, but also emotionally quite disturbing phenomenon and subject. The fact that you can be sitting in a chair in apparently good health one moment and the next moment be discovered looking like Mrs. Weiser is, for many people, not only intimidating, but frightful and horrific. And we've discovered that not just for the general public, but also for professional firefighters, it's much easier to forget about an event like this than it is to pursue it in search of an answer and solutions to how this came to be.
Yeah, this is really perplexing, and unfortunately, not the only such case. After that case, what was the next big case that kind of like took the public by surprise?
Well, we plowed through other newspapers and medical textbooks at the medical library at the College of Physicians down in Philadelphia, the medical libraries at the Hershey Med Center near us, looking for other cases that might be parallel to what we knew had happened to Mrs. Weiser. We found some, but these cases tend to be historically quite old, maybe 100 years old, 200 years old. And the argument that the naysayers would throw at us, well, these are old cases, they were misreported, people weren't intelligent enough or educated sufficiently back in those days to understand that These people were really burning up in dropped cigarettes or carelessly discarded candles still lit or something along that line. So we're thinking maybe, just maybe, Mary Weiser was a one-off case that had something just that nobody was able to discover the supposedly simple cause to. That assessment rapidly and dramatically changed for us in 1975 when we were tipped off to a case that we were told might be similar to what happened to Mary Weiser. It happened here in Pennsylvania, in northern Pennsylvania, in Coudersport, Potter County, in 1966. We made some phone calls. Each person that we spoke to who ostensibly had some involvement in this case gave us information that made us more and more curious. We decided to spend a weekend in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, looking into the fire fatality of one gentleman named Dr. John Irving Bentley. We spoke to the coroner. We spoke to the deputy coroner. We spoke to the gentleman who said he discovered the remains of Dr. Bentley, which we'll describe in a moment. We spoke to several firefighters who helped extricate the ashes of Dr. Bentley from his home on North Main Street in Coudersport. We had a lot of information that sounded very much like what happened to Mary Weiser in 1951, now in our home state of Pennsylvania in 1966. The last person we spoke to on that weekend in a field investigation was a newspaper editor who said he had taken photographs of the fire scene. He said he would never publish them because they were so disturbing, but if he could find them in his files, he would send them to us and we could do whatever we wanted with them because, as we said, he would never publish them. About a week later, we got an envelope from him, tentatively and with great anticipation, opened it, and discovered a set of photographs that just blew us away and confirmed for us that what history had called spontaneous human combustion, what we presently prefer to term sudden human cremation, is not a myth, it's not a superstition, it's not a contrivance of someone with great imagination. This is a real, bona fide medical mystery that is crying out for solution and documentation. Dr. Bentley's death in December 5, 1966, is a legacy, pun intended, that left behind half of one of his legs, a piece of patella, his kneecap, a head that was so badly damaged that it was found lying by some of the first responders on water pipes, but so badly damaged that the other first responders could not recognize that it was a head. The rest of Dr. Bentley's 92-year-old body had immolated through the floor in his bathroom and ended up a pile of ashes, dry powder on his earthen basement floor, and pile of ash about 14 inches in diameter, 5 inches in height. This is the first of the photographs that we pulled out of that envelope that said, my God, what the heck happened here?
Wow. Yeah, this photograph, this is what first turned me on to this subject right here.
This single photograph captures so perfectly the concept of classic spontaneous human combustion, an incredibly localized, apparently quite fearsome fire that can consume a human adult to, as we said, mostly dry powder, and yet fail to significantly damage by heat or any other energy associated with a blazing combustion surrounding combustibles that are much more easily burned than is the human body. The human body generally is almost fire impervious. It's very difficult under normal circumstances to burn up a human body. Arson criminalists, arson murderers have tried to do this with great difficulty. Even using an accelerant such as gasoline makes the challenge quite profound. There was no accelerant involved at the Dr. Bentley fire scene. We stood in his bathroom. We are 6 feet high. We could reach our arm up and touch the ceiling. Above this hole in the floor, there was not a scorch mark to the ceiling. Dr. Bentley was semi-invalidic. He had broken his hip many years prior and used an aluminum walker to help him locomote through his two-room apartment. The aluminum walker, as you can see, is intact. Aluminum will melt at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. On the legs of the walker remain two rubber tips intact. Dr. Bentley's bathtub, on which the walker rested, was painted with enamel paint. You can see where the paint is blackened, but that paint did not blister. We stood in this bathroom and we will attest to that. Oaken beams were burned partially through. The one most severely damaged in the middle is almost burned through in half. It takes many hours for oak wood to burn to that extent. The linoleum was covered with a tar-based old dried linoleum, very flammable. As you can see, beyond the 2 by 3.5 or 2.5 by 3.5 foot hole through which Dr. Bentley's body descended into the basement, the linoleum did not continue to fuel the blaze. Dr. Bentley himself offered very little fuel load to this combustion event. He was dressed in a robe, cotton undergarments. Those two items plus one leather slipper in his body was the fuel loading available to incinerate himself largely to powder. Don Gosnell is the inset. He was the gentleman. He worked as a meter reader for West Penn Gas at the time. He walked into Dr. Bentley's home to read the gas meter in the basement. Here's the gentleman who told us that when he was down in the basement, having finished the meter reading, he spun around and his flashlight beam caught a pile of something on the earthen floor in one corner. Mr. Gosnell, at the time, besides being a meter reader, was a volunteer fireman in Countersport. He was curious. He walked over and kicked that mound of ash with his work boot, saw no embers. He looked overhead and saw the other side of this hole from the basement looking up, rimmed with cherry red embers. Gosnell told us that he thought, must have been a fire overnight. Wonder what burned up, and I wonder why the fire department didn't get a call to put it out. When he went back upstairs and before leaving the house, Countersport being a friendly little community back in 1966, he rapped on the door to make sure that Dr. Bentley was well and yelled a greeting that got no response. Gosnell opened the unlocked door, walked into the doctor's sitting room, did not see him where he normally would have been found sitting in his chair, and stuck his head around the corner of the bathroom. And his first reaction was, there's a mannequin leg on the floor. Wonder what Dr. Bentley was doing with a mannequin leg. And then when Gosnell stooped down closer, he realized that this was not a mannequin leg. This was half of a human leg. He bolted from the house down the street, ran into his office, and yelled the understatement, we believe in 1966, Dr. Bentley's burned up. And yet naysayers say that such a thing absolutely cannot happen. Dr. Lester Adelson, a pathologist in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, wrote an article about why spontaneous human combustion cannot occur. It has to be a myth, the product of superstitious or uneducated people. When that photograph of Dr. Bentley was handed to Dr. Adelson for comment, his reaction was, this is a hoax. Asked why this photograph had to be a hoax, he said, because bodies do not burn this way. We know the provenance of that photograph. This is in the days before Photoshop. This photograph is a historical, genuine documentation of a quote-unquote impossible event. We did ask Dr. Adelson if he had ever investigated a case of spontaneous human combustion. Had he ever gone to a fire scene where this was ostensibly occurring? His answer was no, but he knows better. He doesn't need to go to one of these fire scenes, as we have done several times, because he said, as this caption shows, I do not for a single second buy the overheated concept of spontaneous human combustion. It's a hoax because, as we've already said, according to him, bodies don't burn this way. Well, Dr. Adelson, yes, they do. And therein lies the mystery of sudden human cremation, because he had no way to explain this other than calling it a hoax.
It's unbelievable how there are so many skeptical explanations to this, and some of them just, they don't make any sense. Like what are some of the most outlandish explanations that you've come across?
Oh, golly, most outlandish. How many can we list? Probably the most outlandish is the dreaded phosphenic fart theory.
What?
And this high school kids go to the laboratory and light their flatulence or try to. And this is actually seriously proposed as the explanation for why people like Dr. Bentley would end up looking like this, or why Mary Reeser would end up looking like she did. Um, if that theory has any merit whatsoever, we would expect to find lots of teenagers in high school bathrooms or into piles of powder. We do not find that situation whatsoever. Um, So we've written that one off as an outlandish theory that has absolutely no physical, mental, or psychological or intellectual significance or merit to it whatsoever. The theory that is most often proposed is the Wick effect. And if you've seen any of the programs that have appeared on television, often by us or involving us, you'll find the human candle wick theory proffered endlessly as the solution to so-called spontaneous human combustion. It's basically this: you take an external ignition source like a match or a cigarette or a broken butane lighter, and ideally you add a lot of alcohol to it and then throw in a person and you end up with question mark, Mary Reeser or Dr. Bentley or hundreds of other similar cases that we found in our research throughout the world over several centuries. When we first began our research, we thought, could this be? Does this work? We did our own experiments. Every one of them failed laughably. And if memory serves, 1999, we did a program for the BBC. They came to our house first. And at that time, we had for 1 year marinated a ham shank, ham with a bone, and a marinade of whiskey, bourbon, and brandy. And we said, we'll take this out of the refrigerator. We'll wrap it in a cotton cloth. We'll put it on a old tar-based linoleum flooring and put that on a plank of wood, just like you would have found in Dr. Bentley's bathroom. And then we will light it, and you can film it. And if it burns to powder, we'll be surprised, but you will have captured, anyway, whatever the result of the experiment, you will have it on film. After about an hour, the flame, this was done outside with infinite amount of oxygen to fuel the combustion. After about an hour, the fire self-extinguished. We unwrapped the still intact cotton around the ham shank. And the ham shank in part had superficial charring, but was like 98 to 90% intact, not a pile of dried powder. The producer for that BBC production was next scheduled to go to California to meet with Dr. John DeHaan, a renowned fire scientist, and he had promised the BBC that he could prove SHC was a myth by proving that human candlewick can burn something to powder. The last thing we said to the producer before he left our office here in Harrisburg en route to California was, if John DeHaan can do what he claims he can do, it will be historically and scientifically very significant. But don't let him use an accelerant like gasoline on his burn sample. When the program aired, guess what John DeHaan used in his burning of a pig, which was his stand-in for the human body? He poured a liter of gasoline on the burn sample. Well, of course, that's going to fuel combustion. That's going to exacerbate the fire. But we don't find accelerants in classic cases of spontaneous human combustion. So we conducted a really bizarre and totally inappropriate scientific experiment. But John wasn't done with that. He was given another opportunity on a program that aired on the Learning Channel a couple years later, this time as a stand-in for the human body instead of using a pig carcass, which is appropriate to do. We have no argument with that. But this time, instead of a pig carcass, he used a fistful of candles. About a dozen candles that he wrapped in cotton cloth and laid on a chair. And then he lit it. And he stands there in the burn chamber saying, look, I've got a small localized blaze. This is going to end up looking just like these photos that Larry claims is spontaneous human combustion. Ha ha. Well, the fire got bigger, and then it got bigger, and then it got bigger. And it got so big that John DeHaan decided And it's not comfortable nor safe to be in this burn chamber. He exited the burn chamber. When the program cuts back, the fire is out, and John is standing there saying, look, we've had a localized blaze. It went out. Minimal surrounding fire damage to newspapers that he had put on an end table next to his chair. This is also supposed to represent a case that occurred in Bolingbrook, Illinois in 1979, when in fact he was replicating a case that happened in Pennsylvania. Again in Pennsylvania back in 1966 to Highway Conway, and we'll probably get to that case in a short time. But he stands there with a chair that is minimally damaged, telling the world that he's just proven the wick effect has disproved the concept of spontaneous human combustion. What John knew, but this program did not display, was that this was not at all what actually happened, because the production company that did this program from TLC had sent to us before this program aired their original production that they had sent to TLC. And their original production very dramatically and quite significantly in one small detail from what the viewing public got to see. And what originally happened in the burn chamber was not a small fire that self-extinguished, but a roaring inferno that was within moments, probably seconds, of full flashover. John had extricated himself by that time from the fire chamber because it was way too hot to be inside. The cameraman himself had to back out, and fire suppression equipment was ordered to extinguish this roaring inferno. John knew that this was not a small, localized fire. And then he goes back into the burn chamber after the fire is extinguished to tell the viewing public that he successfully replicated a localized, low-heat, smoldering fire that he believes explains cases like Dr. Bentley and Mary Weiser. We're going to be very blunt with you. That's a lie. And John knows it's a lie. Why he did this remains a mystery to us, as great as that of spontaneous human combustion itself. He is well regarded in the fire service community, and yet why he would so misrepresent what happened here in an effort to debunk and dismiss SHC is itself a story in its all to itself.
Yeah, that's a shame when those things.
It shows the extreme that we have had to encounter over now 40 plus years of investigating this phenomenon, and we believe investigating it thoroughly, competently, and above all, honestly. We have been led to cases that were presented to us as SHC, and we found reasons to dismiss that assessment. We could find conventional explanations for some of these cases. And when we've done that, we have said so in our book ablaze. On the other hand, we're not going to lie about the cases that we've documented. We're not going to make up quotes. We have spent countless hours talking to the first responders, those who have been actually at these fire scenes. And in some cases, we ourselves have been able to be at these remarkable fire scenes. We know what the fire scenes look like. We know what the odors were like. We know that accelerants were not involved. We know that fire suppression equipment was not brought in. And yet when we try to present this evidence to people in the mainstream fire service community, we are met again and again and again with rebuff, with dismissal, and in some cases with just laughable circumstances. When we went down to the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, just before wrapping up writing of our book ablaze, we tried to meet with three senior fire instructors who were on duty that day. One of them expressed mild interest but didn't want to see any of the photos. The second instructor to whom we attempted to hand the photos literally spun on his heels and ran down the hallway saying, "I don't want to see those." The third instructor happened to be walking by when that incident occurred. He paused, he came over, looked at our photographs and said, "Hey, you know what? Come into my office, sit down and tell me everything you know, because we don't have a clue." He was genuinely interested. We'd like to see that happen in all areas and all levels of the professional fire services. Unfortunately, that's not been our experience. Memorably, when we were down in Philadelphia looking at several cases in the Philadelphia area, One of them was the Conway case, which we'll get to later probably. We sat down in the office of one of their senior fire investigators and put the photographs of Mary Reeser, Dr. Bentley, and Helen Conway on his desk and said, "You're the expert. We're the amateur. Help us understand how these fires could have occurred. We'd like to know. How would you react if you were called to a fire scene and you discovered a fire scene that looked like one of these photographs? What would you do?" We shall never forget his answer to us. It was this, quote unquote, "I'd go out, I'd get drunk, and I'd forget about it."
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to sum it up because this is really disturbing. We're going to pull up the photo of the Conway case here. Now, this took place in Upper Darby, right, in
Yes.
1964.
Yeah. Right.
And I just want to talk about, this case, the Conway case, the Reeser case, the Bentley case. They shared something in common, didn't they?
Let's see. They were all humans. They were all fairly elderly. Two were female, one was male. They all lived, well, no, we're going to say they all lived alone, but they didn't. Dr. Bentley did live alone. Mary Reeser lived by herself in an apartment, but others were in the apartment building nearby. And Helen Conway lived with her family. Two family members were downstairs on Sunday morning when this episode transpired. Other members of the family had left shortly before this fire scene was discovered, and they were away at church that Sunday morning. What do you see as the common factor, Justin?
Well, I remember you talking about this before, and I'm just going to put it out there so that we can kind of discuss this because I'm sure a lot of the skeptics bring this into the equation too. And correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't all three of those victims, they were known smokers, right?
Okay. Helen Conway was a heavy smoker, reasonably heavy smoker. That is correct. Mary Reeser was said to be a smoker also. Dr. Bentley, on the other hand, was a pipe smoker. And while it's been argued by many of the naysayers that Dr. Bentley, the reason for his smoking mishap was that he was sitting in his chair and dropped the pipe in his lap or dropped embers from that pipe in his lap and consequently caught his robe aflame and spent the next 5 minutes hobbling with his walker from his sitting chair to the bathroom in search of water to quench the fiery robe that he was engulfed in. Now, some problems with that as we see it. One, the first responders noticed that when they arrived at the Bentley household, Dr. Bentley's pipe was in its holder on a stand next to his chair. If Dr. Bentley had dropped a lit pipe in his lap and caught his robe aflame, it's unlikely, in fact, we would argue that it's nonsensical, that he would have reached into his burning lap to pick up the pipe and put it neatly in its holder next to his chair before trying to extricate himself from his fiery situation. Secondly, Dr. Bentley was largely infirm. As we said, according to his nurse, whom we interviewed, it took Bentley 5 minutes to walk from his chair to the bathroom with his walker. If his robe were afire at the time, what he would have done, he was infirm but not insane. He was very cogent, mentally keen. He would have done what his medical training had told him to do in a fire situation, which would have been to drop and roll or get out of a burning garment. It's argued by Joe Nickel and other skeptics that Dr. Bentley hobbled with his garments aflame, setting the carpeting in his sitting room aflame as he slowly transgressed across the room to the bathroom in search of water to put out his fiery robe. Doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Yes, he had spark holes in his robe. He had spark holes allegedly on other garments. But what made this particular night of December 5, 1966, so remarkable that in all the previous times that he had spark holes in his garments, every time those garments did not inflame, what made it so unique this evening, and only this evening, that an alleged spark hole or dropped ember from his pipe caused him to become a raging inferno more intense than can be accomplished in normal conditions in a crematorium retort? That's the question none of the naysayers can address and answer properly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, that's why I brought that up, because it, it it doesn't account for all the cases either, because not everybody is a smoker. So
You're absolutely right, Justin. Absolutely right. If we go back to the Conway overview again, we can address that point further. The gentleman in the insert is Fire Chief Paul Haggerty. He was one of the first responders. We interviewed Chief Haggerty at great length, as well as at the time, the fire photographer who later became the fire marshal for Upper Darby, Bob Meslin, as well as the assistant fire marshal, Harry Lott. All three gentlemen confirmed the details of this remarkable fire scene. Paul Haggerty himself had been to several fire fatalities in which dropped cigarettes had indeed been the cause of the blaze. But as Paul Haggerty said to us, and in fact, he showed us photographs of some of those fire scenes, none of the victims in those fire scenes were burned to the extent that Helen Conway was. The bodies were completely intact in the burned chairs. They could be taken to a morgue and completely autopsied. Internal organs existed. And those fires took a long time. What so astounded Chief Haggerty, Fire Marshal Meslin, and Deputy Fire Marshal Lott was, in the Conway case, not only the extent of destruction to her body, but the time frame in which this event happened. We have correspondence from those gentlemen, Bob Meslin in particular. The initial correspondence said that no more than 21 minutes could have elapsed from the time that Mrs. Conway was known to be alive until the firemen arrived to put out a fire that really did not need to be put out. When they first arrived, the room was filled with dense black smoke. That's a bit atypical, but there was no odor of noxious burned human flesh. There was no fire damage to the ceiling overhead. In fact, the first responder who went in on his hands and knees knew that a person had lived in this room. He went in on his hands and knees in complete opaqueness, with his forearm outstretched looking for Mrs. Conway. He put his hand in something, he did not know exactly what, but presumed that he had touched Mrs. Conway, and presumed that at that point she had deceased. When the smoke ejection equipment was brought in and the room air was cleared out, he realized that where he put his hand was in the lap of Mrs. Conway. And we were told it was a very long time before that firefighter would respond to another fire call involving human or just property. Very psychologically disturbing to him, and understandably so. But coming back to that 20-minute time frame, when we sat down in Bob Meslin's kitchen and went over the photographs that he kindly gave to us, he took 12 photographs. This is just one of them, of this remarkable fire scene. When we worked the timeline with him, we learned that from the time that the fire department got the call, made the response, realized that this was a fire fatality, Mr. Meslin was sent from the fire scene back to get his camera and return and take a dozen photographs. We can narrow that 21-minute time frame down to an astonishingly impossible 360 seconds, 6 minutes, based on all the interviews with the first responders that we had the privilege to meet. You cannot, under any known conditions, other than perhaps a high temperature accelerant, incinerate a body to this extent. Certainly not in a crematorium retort, and not without lots of filters and lots of fuel and the noxious odor of burned human flesh. There are so many aspects to the Conway case. We kept this confidential for many years. In fact, it was incredibly difficult to even find this case. We really lucked out. The universe was fortuitously behind us, tracking this photo down. We discovered this case by attending an advanced arson fire science course at the Pennsylvania Fire Academy. And at the end of that course, the instructor, Buzz Trebold, pulled out a photograph and said, "Hey, I just got this photograph, and some people say it's spontaneous human combustion. A lady burned up and on a chair." And he passed the photograph around to the classmates, and before it got to us, we turned to a firefighter sitting next to us and we said, oh, this has got to be the Reeser case. So we're talking about what happened to Mary Reeser. And then the photograph ended up in our hands. So we looked at it and said, holy shit, this is not Mary Reeser. This is a case we know nothing about. So as soon as the class was dismissed, we went up to Buzz Truebo and said, who, where, when, what, we want to track this down. He said, I don't know, other than this is a fire that happened somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania. Well, those folks who know the geography of Pennsylvania know that that's Philadelphia, the most populous part of Pennsylvania. Justin, you certainly know this.
Yeah.
How are we going to find a fire fatality in southeastern Pennsylvania when we have no name, no date, no fire department, nothing but a photograph? It took us 9 months, but we tracked it down and we found this photograph and got in touch with Bob Meslin and the other fire officials, and the rest is history. We sat on this case until we had the book published. So Book Ablaze is the first public debut of this remarkable human incineration. It's just bizarre. And once again, it fits the hallmark conditions of what history has called spontaneous human combustion. An apparently fearsome yet highly localized blaze that is capable of reducing a body beyond all common sense. One of our critics, Mark Benecke, says that spontaneous human combustion cannot occur, as the caption of this photo from Dr. Adelson says, bodies don't burn this way. Well, Dr. Adelson, this one did. Mark Benecke says that spontaneous human combustion doesn't happen because there is no case in history where internal organs are burned more severely than our external body parts. Ergo, these bodies all have to burn from the outside inward, not from the inside outward. Well, once again, Mark Benecke, as a student well-educated as he is about all things forensic and biology, he's flat out wrong. In Dr. Bentley's case, there was no internal organ left, other than perhaps the brain in his skull. We do not know that, but no heart, no liver, no pancreas, no bile duct, no lungs. We say the same for Mary Reeser. So those two cases alone belie Mark Benecke's argument that there is no case where internal body parts of a corpse are damaged more severely than the outer parts. He's flat out wrong. And we've got the photographic proof that he's flat out wrong.
I mean, it's just so remarkable that this is happening at all, and I think, there's the different degrees, the different burn degrees, right? And, in the classification, right? This, you call this a 5th degree burn. This has got to be added to the burn degrees, right? And currently it does not exist.
Exactly. Excellent point, Justin. When we began our research, there were 3 degrees of burn injury: first, second, and third. First is reddening of the skin, mild sunburn. Second is blistering of the skin, very bad sunburn. We've had that. We know what a second degree burn looks like. We know what it feels like. Third degree burn was everything else. Then the fire service industry came up with a 4th and a 5th degree burn category. 4th degree was when you had damage subcutaneously. 5th degree is when there's deep char to muscle tissue. Okay. Dr. Bentley, Mary Reeser, and others exhibited something far beyond deep muscle char burn damage. These people ashened to dry powder. So if fire service presently says 5th degree is no serious burn, then these cases warrant a whole new classification. 6th degree burn. Some fire officials are now arguing for a 6th degree burn, which is very deep char burn into the skeleton, in which case then these cases have to be a 7th degree burn, because not just internal organs are damaged and destroyed. The skeleton, the bone matrix itself, is completely ashened. And even in a crematorium, in a retort where temperatures can reach 22 to 2400 degrees for an hour to an hour and a half, what is raked out of a retort oven is bone fragment, not just ashes, but bone fragments. Those fragments are put in a cremulator. a mechanical device that grinds those bone fragments to powder. Dr. Krogman told us in his experiments, if the temperature was under 3,000 degrees for 12 hours, he could pull out of the burn oven bone fragments that, with his background and knowledge in forensic anthropology, he could identify. And yet in cases like Mary Weiser and Dr. Bentley and retired firefighter George Mott in upstate New York in 1986, the bone is calcined. It is powder. It does not have to be ground up because it crumbles to dust when touched.
Yeah, and let's let's touch on that that Mott case now, because this is one of the best documented cases, and it plays into the whole smoking aspect. But here's why: he was a smoker, but he stopped cold turkey 15 years before this, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you can't use that to explain this, here.
Well, it's been tried, and we'll love to get into the ludicrousness of the attempt to try to write off George Mott as a smoking mishap. But anyway, this is George Mott, upper left, retired firefighter, fought fires in Tioga, upstate New York. In 1966, he had retired to this wooden 20 by 40 foot house, tinderbox of an environment, actually, on the outskirts of Crown Point, New York, outside of Ticonderoga. In late March, he had not been visited by had checked in with his family for about a day and a half prior to his son, Kendall Mott, going out to this house to check on his dad. The front door, probably you can't see it in this photograph, but there's a sign on the front door that says no smoking. George Mott had smoked, as you correctly point out, 10 or 15 years earlier, but had quit cold turkey. He was now an avowed non-smoker. And while his son Kendall did smoke, the only way Kendall could smoke around his dad's house was to go outside to smoke. George Mott refused to allow anyone inside his house smoking. The irony of this is that in late March of 1986, George Mott himself went up in smoke in a way that made no sense to any of the investigators at the time whom we interviewed at length, with one exception. George Mott was discovered by a friend of his son, Kendall, in the back room of the house. We were at this fire scene twice. When you walk in the front door, past the sign that says no smoking, you walked into George Mott's living room. There was some discoloration near the top of the walls and on the ceiling in the living room. This is an incredibly complicated, complex, and quite bizarre fire scene. We discussed it thoroughly in our book Ablaze, and even more thoroughly in a separate publication we did for the Info Journal. But if you walk through the living room to the rear of the house, through that open doorway, you can see what looks like the headboard of a bed, which is exactly what it is. In that bed, George Mott had laid down and met a flaming fate that belied everything he had previously encountered as a professional volunteer firefighter. He managed to burn himself through his mattress, through the wood flooring below the bed, and ended up, as the first responders told us, a pile of calcined powder on the earthen floor below his bed. On his bed, he left behind half of one leg. We have lectured for almost 20 years, maybe longer than 20 years, to students of fire science at the Harrisburg Area Community College on this subject. When we put this photograph up to them, we say, in this photograph is a body part. Can you find it? And all that time, we think we've had one student who was able to come close to finding the body part. Firefighters cannot find George Mott's leg, but where the arrow is pointed out, the arrow on the right are the toes of George Mott's right leg. Left arrow points to where that right leg had burned clean off just around the kneecap, reminiscent, of course, of Dr. Bentley's remaining one leg, half leg. his legacy, if you will, to the fire phenomenon that we're discussing with you this evening. The rest of George Mott's body, as we said, was powder burned through the mattress into the floor below. The shape of the mattress is in a deep V, suggesting to us that George Mott, the incineration of his body, had a vector that was strongly forceful downward. We say these people do not burn up, they burn down. We were in the bed in this bedroom after the light had been removed, but nothing else had significantly been changed. Once again, we could stretch our arm towards the ceiling and touch the ceiling. The ceiling is basically pristine. It is not burned. It is not charred. So how do we explain this? Well, we look first at electrical outlets. Could an electric arc from one of the outlets in George Mott's bedroom cause this incredible fire? No. There was no evidence of electrical arcing in any of the outlets in the bedroom. That was confirmed by the county fire investigator and by the emergency director for Essex County as well, Bob Purdy. We did talk to a member of the BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in New York, and he insisted that yes, indeed, an electrical arc had caused this. Well, we tore those electrical outlets apart, as did the local fire officials, and we will tell you there was no evidence of electrical arcing whatsoever. There were strange artifacts, well, there were artifacts that were strangely burned or melted elsewhere in George Mott's home. The photo on the left shows where a plastic paddled fly swatter had hung. The middle arm of the fly swatter is still hanging on the wall, but the pinpoint is pointing to where the plastic had been. It's now completely melted away. The photo on the right, beside that photo, is a thermometer at the far end of the house. You can see that it is melted, but the mercury did not rupture above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Below is a photograph that we took in George Mott's library at the other extreme of the house, about 25 feet away from George Mott's bedroom. Once again, the thermometer did not break, but it shows a bit of heat distortion. A plastic container that held tissues. The plastic is melted partially, but the tissues inside the box did not catch fire. George Mott had an eclectic collection of reading material. One of the books was a book by Reader's Digest that contained, believe it or not, a chapter discussing spontaneous human combustion. We took that as an artifact to study later. It was analyzed in conjunction with M. Sue Benford, a brilliant scientist associated with Ohio State University. And the analysis of that book jacket, the sooting on it, indicated that this had to be some kind of a nuclear event because the dating of the paper was way off. Other factors indicated that this had to be some kind of a nuclear type event, certainly not an oxidizing type of combustion event. As to George Mott being a smoker or not being a smoker, next to George Mott's bedroom, next to his bed, in the bedroom was an oxygen enrichment machine. So there was an increased amount of oxygen slightly available in his bedroom, but on top of the machine was a canister of long-handled wooden stick matches. One of our critics, I'm sure many of your participants will recognize the name, Joe Nickel, looks at that canister of matches and goes, aha, matches. Why would those matches be there? Well, they must be there because George Mott decided that after 10 or 15 years of being an avowed, confirmed non-smoker, he suddenly, this night in late March 1986, decided that he just had to have one more cigarette. And that's why those matches are there. He used one of those matches to light a cigarette, and gosh darn it, he either dropped the cigarette or he had a heart attack and dropped the lit cigarette or match on his pajamas, and darn it, he slowly emanated to that pile of powder that we found underneath his bed. End of mystery, Larry. It's not spontaneous human combustion at all. Well, you know what, Mr. Nickel? The reason those matches were there was not because George Mott had this bizarre craving after a decade or more of being a non-smoker. The matches were there because on the other side of Mr. Mott's bedroom was the furnace that heated Mr. Mott's 20 by 40-foot ramshackle tinderbox of a home. The matches were there because he used it to light the oil burner, not because he had a craving for a cigarette. This is the kind of insidious, make-believe, let's just suppose argument that critics have to rely upon in order not to confront the facts of these remarkable human incinerations.
I tend to think that when a lot of the skeptics come into the equation and they try to process it using human logic, using frames of references that only make sense in their own world, instead of considering that there is another world, one full of mystery, one full of things we do not understand. And no matter how disturbing that world may be, we have to accept it as a possibility, as a reality. And we've covered a lot of cases where the victims did not survive, but there have been a bunch of cases where they have survived, right?
Yes, yes. At least let's say it is our assessment and our conclusion that not only does sudden human cremation occur in these remarkable fatality cases, these remarkable fatal fire scenes, but we actually can come back and defend spontaneous human combustion for the survivors of partial, bizarre human burnings.
Yeah, let's get into that. Let's tackle that subject.
This is an area where the skeptics really don't want to go, and where they get really annoyed with Larry Arnold. But as we've seen Joe Nickel recently attest on a television show that did not involve our participation, he said in conclusion regarding Dr. Bentley specifically, but SHC in general, these cases can't happen because chemistry can't explain them. And if chemistry can't explain them, then there's nothing mysterious about them, and it has to fall back on the Wick effect. Well, in making that statement, in our view, Mr. Nickel has inadvertently given himself away as both not a skeptic and not a scientist, because he's stating that everything that there is to know about chemistry is now known. And furthermore, he knows everything there is to know about chemistry, and unable to dismiss chemistry as the means by which these fires occur. There's no mystery and nothing to discover. Well, we'll stake our reputation and our 7 decades of living that chemists haven't yet discovered everything about chemistry that there is to discover. And beyond that, why limit your field of inquiry to chemistry? Why not consider biology, electricity, quantum physics, a whole raft of other disciplines that might have some significant bearing on the causes of these incredible fires? Which brings us back to those who survive partial spontaneous human combustion.
Yeah, which one do you want to tackle first here?
Well, let's start with Jack Angel, because this was the first case that we were able to investigate and conclude that something not only quite remarkable, but something quite unexplainable has happened to this traveling salesman who was asleep one night, or probably several nights, in his motorhome in Savannah, Georgia in 1974. Mr. Angel was happily married at the time, earning a good living as a clothing salesman traveling on the road. He went to sleep expecting to meet with a client the following morning. He told us that he missed that appointment, and when he awakened, he noticed that his right forearm had been burned black, burned to the bone. Yet his pajamas were not damaged. The sheets on which he slept were unsinged. He dressed himself, exited his motorhome, walked into a Ramada Inn, ordered a drink, which he said was not typical for himself, and lost consciousness. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in the Savannah Memorial General Hospital, surrounded by a team of physicians who were marveling about the burn injuries that they were called in to treat. We have Jack's medical records. We spoke to several of his attending physicians, including Dr. Fern. The medical records logged that Jack Angel's burns to his right forearm, burns to the bone, or quote unquote internal in origin. They were of an electrical type nature, but the motorhome was torn down to the wheelbase, looking for a means by which Jack could have been accidentally burned by an electrical failure, a mechanical failure, scalding water, because this case was going to go to court and several $1 million in damages were being sought by Jack's attorneys. The case had to be pulled from the document because they could not beat the burden of proof. We sat down with both attorneys in their office in Atlanta, Georgia. They were mystified. They just could not explain how any external known means could have burned Jack to this extent. The burn was so severe that Jack elected to have the right arm amputated just below the elbow. And we will never forget sitting in front of Jack as he waved that stump of his right arm in our face and said, it was spontaneous human combustion that happened to him. What the hell else could it have been? And we have to concur, in part, as we said, because we have the medical evidence by the physicians who treated him that these burns were, quote unquote, internal in origin. He didn't burn from the outside in, he burned from the inside out. He also had other physiological damage to himself, burns on his groin, damage to his spinal column, to the disc in his spinal column, burns on the nape of his neck. None of these fit with a typical scalding burn injury. They would fit, however, with a quasi-electrical type burn injury, but one that could not be attributable to lightning or an electrical short or malfunction in his motorhome. So the mystery of Jack Angel's burns remains to this day. We've since spoken to perhaps 24 other individuals who have had similar, albeit sometimes slightly different cases, where they too have had their bodies go up in smoke or spontaneously blister by means unidentified and unexplained. But just as an aside, by definition, if you are severely sunburned, you've experienced and survived spontaneous human combustion. You've not been in contact with a high heat radiant source. You've not been electrocuted. You've not touched an open flame, and your skin will blister. As we said earlier, we have this from personal experience. Science knows what causes that type of burn. It's radiation from the sun, but it's invisible. You don't see it, and you don't feel it until after the effects have taken place. This is our definition of spontaneous human combustion. It is the blistering, smoking, or burning of flesh in the absence of a known, identifiable, nearby external burn agent. If you can rule out contact with an open flame or caustic chemicals or radioactive material, high amperage electricity, or a nearby radiant heat source, then a first responder who encounters a case like Alan Conway, Mary Hardy Weiser, Dr. Bentley, George Mott, and the survivors, you need to consider spontaneous human combustion when you file your fire incident report.
I want to go back to the Jack Angel case for a minute here.
Okay.
One thing so let me just recap what took place. Jack Angel, he's a traveling salesman. He's in his motorhome. He's going to meet with a client the next morning. He misses that appointment because he woke up and he saw his arm completely charred. One would think, right, if your arm is burning, wouldn't you wake up from, I don't know, the pain, right? But didn't you bring up a point in your research that a lot of the survivors do not speak of pain?
You're correct, Justin. And this is another aspect of the phenomenon that belies common sense and strongly suggests to us that this is not a normal oxidizing type of fire process. This is something else. Jack Angel slept through his immolation of his forearm. I think one of the reasons some people, at least, are so put off by the subject is because they think that these victims must have undergone prolonged, agonizing pain. And that for them is understandably emotionally and psychologically distressing, and it's easier just not to have to think about it. But from the research that we've done, which obviously includes talking to survivors of partial SHC, they do not experience the type of agonizing discomfort and pain that you would expect these people to suffer. These fires are not like putting your hand on a hot stove burner. It doesn't hurt. The expression that's been given to us from the survivors, what does it feel like? Well, it's kind of a tingling, like when circulation is cut off in your forearm, or there's a mild heat. Lady in Ohio, she was standing in her kitchen one morning after breakfast, and she felt a mild heat up her back. She turned her head to look toward her shoulder and saw smoke coming from her upper shoulder, her back. She yelled out to her husband, who at one time had worked in a crematorium, ironically. He rushed in, took off her outer garments to discover that the source of the smoke was her flesh itself. Another similar case happened to Peter Jones. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in 1980, getting dressed to go to work. His wife, Barb, was still in bed beside him. Suddenly, he was engulfed in a billowing plume of whitish gray smoke that emanated from his lower abdomen, from his crotch area. Barb sat upright and said, "What the hell is that?" Her husband said, "I don't know." She patted on his upper thighs, on his back, on his groin to try to put out the quote unquote fire. The smoking eventually ended, and they sat on the bed looking at each other completely bumfuddled. There was no external ignition source available in the bedroom. Later that day, Peter Jones was in his car alone, sitting at a railroad grade crossing, waiting for the train to go by. And for the second time in that day, he told us that his forearms once again began to exude. This time his forearms exuded the same color of whitish gray smoke, filling up the interior of the car. Peter Jones is a remarkable individual that he can remain calm under the most extenuating and distressful sources of fire. He rolled down the window of his car, vented the smoke. The train went by, the smoking stopped, and he drove home and never told his wife, Barbara, about this second incident until the two of them were watching a program on ABC television in 1980 called That's Incredible, in which we debuted for the first time on television the remarkable fire scene of Dr. Bentley. And Peter turned to his wife and said, "Do you remember what happened to me last October in the bedroom?" And she said, how could I forget it? He told her, "Well, it happened to me twice that day, and I didn't have the courage to tell you until now." So even survivors of this phenomenon are reticent to talk about it. It's been difficult, even when we have been able to identify these individuals, to get them to open up about it, because it's baffling, it's bizarre. It certainly opens them up to ridicule, and they don't deserve that. We treat them with the utmost respect because, in our view, they have been experiencing collectively something that mainstream fire science and modern medicine has no answer for.
It reminds me of what we were just talking about with the Jack Angel case, because it doesn't stop, or it may not stop at just one event. There may be multiple events to the same individual. There was one that that you researched, the Frank Baker case, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about that one, because
okay, Frank Baker. Yeah. Before we get into that, the name of the Ohio woman is Kay Fletcher, and her husband's name is Mike. We knew our brain synapses would click in here eventually. Frank Baker, Purple Heart recipient, lived in upstate New York. I'm sorry, not upstate New York, upstate Vermont. In 1974, if memory serves, he was with a friend getting ready to go on a fishing derby, and sitting in his living room, his body, as he told us, and his friend confirms, went up in flames, suddenly and quite literally, spontaneously. His friend leapt to his feet, rushed over to Frank, and started banging away at Frank and what would commonsensically be trying to put out the fire. And the fire, and we put air quotes around the word fire, went out. And they looked at each other in complete and utter amazement, with no explanation whatsoever as to how this could have ensued. Not too long after that, the two of them found themselves, this time fishing again, now in a boat in a lake. And according to Frank and his friend, the same type of situation again happened to him. And again, fortuitously, the fire extinguished, allowing him to become, as was Peter Jones, a double survivor of this extraordinarily rare and nonsensical phenomenon. And we do want to stress, this is rare. This is a rare event. We have been able to track down what we believe to number about 500 cases now of a phenomenon of circumstances that fall within the definition that history has given for spontaneous human combustion. That's a huge number of cases for something that is supposedly not supposed to happen at all. But divided into the number of people that have been alive on the planet in those several hundred years, the odds are very much in favor that you would never encounter, never experience, and without people like us, likely never even hear about the subject of spontaneous human combustion. But within that database, the cases are incredibly varied, even though they fall within the general definition. We gave you a photograph from the British Medical Journal, 1888 case of what the journal identifies as only Mr. AM. We've since learned that his name is Albert Minster. He was found in a hayloft in a barn in Aberdeen, Scotland, early 1888. Bystanders noticed smoke coming from the hayloft. In 1888, this was a serious concern. You didn't want a barn going up in flames because it would take down in a city environment more than the barn. They rushed up to find Mr. AM lying on straw in the loft of the barn. His body looks to be intact. You can easily recognize his legs, his torso, his head. Some shingles from the barn roof apparently had fallen on his body. What is remarkable about this is, first off, when the body was attempted to be, this is an etching published in the British Medical Journal from a photograph that was taken at the scene. After the photograph was taken, rescuers attempted to pick up and remove the body from the hayloft. When it was touched, Mr. Ames' body crumbled to powder in their hands. That's not how bodies burn, particularly not when surrounded by hay and straw. The person who wrote up the case for the British Medical Journal was Dr. Mackenzie Booth. He described and concluded this was an example of one of those rare phenomena called internal ignition, which is another name for spontaneous human combustion.
There's another photo here that you had sent me, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this. It's a Glasters, three Brit women,
yes.
Or as you call it, the three British babes burning.
These are three photographs from a chapter that was published by Glasters Medical Jurisprudence and Toxicology, only in the 1973 edition. It's in a chapter about the forensics of the effects of fire on human bodies. There's a photograph of a badly burned, at that time would have been a 3rd degree burn, now it would be called a 5th or 6th degree burn, of a person who was burned, incinerated inside a structure fire. Structure fires, by the way, normally reach temperatures between 1500 and 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. This individual was badly burned, and yet he could be picked up, removed en masse, and taken to a morgue for autopsy. You can make out the legs, the torso, the head, everything is there. The internal organs are there to be autopsied. looking for scenes of evidence of foul play, looking for evidence of an accelerant and all that stuff. But in that chapter of glaciers are these three remarkable photographs that belie a conventional, normal fire fatality scene. We have no dates for these photographs. The publishers whom we did contact and who gave us permission to use these photographs in our presentations had no information about the background of these cases, no dates, no places, no names, but they clearly photographically document what history has defined as classic spontaneous human combustion. The photo on the left shows two lower legs in stocking feet intact. Above the calves is an amorphous mound of ash, and yet directly above that amorphous pile of ash, which was the remnants of the woman's body, is a tea towel draped over an open drawer. That tea towel is unaffected whatsoever. The photograph in the middle is of a lady who was seated in a chair. The chair cushion is burned away down to the springs, but it looks to us like the body, the torso, and the lower anatomy was burned away so that the top half intact became top heavy and tumbled off the chair and fell onto the floor. Her shoulders, forearms, and head are intact. At the other extreme of that anatomy are 2 feet intact, but everything else in between is incinerated to ashes and unidentifiable material. The photograph at the right, clearly a female, nylon stockings on her lower legs. Above the knees, once again, is a charred residue of non-identifiable anatomical remains until you get to a partial hand burned off at the wrist and a skull that appears to have been severed in half, somewhat reminiscent of the Dr. Bentley fire scene. We would so much like to know more about each of these 3 cases. How old were they? Was there any history of alcohol abuse or smoking? Could there have been an arson murder? Highly, highly unlikely, because again, you would need a high temperature accelerant to do this kind of damage to the body. Was there damage to the ceiling overhead? We wager not, but we simply don't know. While we have identified some 500 cases in our research over the past 40 some years, we absolutely do know that more cases of this phenomenon have occurred that we have been unable to identify. We've had rumors, allegations, hearsay, hints that, this firefighter heard about a case when he attended a fire seminar that happened in Florida, or a case that happened in Colorado, or a case that happened in Indiana, or another case that happened in California. We've not been able to track these cases down, but we know they exist. Unfortunately, it's been easier for many in the fire service industry who, as we said about the fire inspector in Philadelphia, are so nonplussed, so disturbed, so unnerved by these remarkable fire scenes that it is more comfortable psychologically and emotionally for them to mentally, if not physically, sweep the ashes under the rug, so to speak, and forget about it, than to do what they are hired to do as professionals, which is to investigate fires, regardless of how conventional or how unconventional the fire may be. That's where we come in.
Even though what we have in front of us is a very rare phenomenon, at least the known cases, right? There may be, like you alluded to, there may be a lot more cases. This may not be quite as extremely, extremely rare. It may be more common than we would like to admit, or maybe than we can understand or fathom. But a lot of the cases, though, these are older cases. What about today? Have there been any of recent times that we can point to?
Yeah, we'll argue first that all the cases that we've detailed with you are recent, from the 1950s and onward. The most recent case we are wanting to stake our research and reputation on occurred in Oklahoma in 2013. Classic case. We did not include the photograph there because there are still issues with the next of kin. We flew to Oklahoma. We met with the first responders, with the fire chief, with the sheriff, who raised the possibility that this fire fatality was indeed spontaneous human combustion. And oh, you can imagine the ribbing and the condensate, the ridicule that he was subjected to on the internet. He's a rube. He's an okie. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Spontaneous human combustion? Can't be. What a stupid sheriff he is. Well, what the critics didn't know was that Sheriff Lockhart, before becoming sheriff of Sequoia County, had spent 20 years as an arson investigator. He knew what fire scenes are supposed to look like. He knew how bodies are supposed to burn. And this one belied everything that he understood should be encountered at a fatal fire scene. As the fire chief told us, direct quote, this fire began in and ended at the body. Fire was extremely localized. In this case, the head and upper shoulders did remain. The lower feet, the feet and parts of the lower legs remained, but the rest of the body had pretty much burned through a hole in his kitchen floor. This happened right next to the gentleman's refrigerator. The refrigerator has just a minor bit of caramel colored discoloration on part of the refrigerator door. No other damage. No damage, no indication of a heat source, a flame source in the kitchen stove, or anywhere else in the gentleman's living space. Again, no damage overhead. This gentleman, as we suggested others have, did not burn up or burn down. As we said, we flew out to meet with the first responders and desperately wanted to meet with the family members to learn more about this individual's background. He was a heavy smoker. He was a heavy consumer of alcohol, to the extent that we were told he drank some 30 cans of beer a day, which is beyond our comprehension. And we like beer, but 30 cans a day, we can't fathom that. That's as baffling as SHC is itself. But anyway, that's what we were told. Did he have a medical history that would help? Did he have any kind of medical conditions? Was he on any kind of medication? What was his psychological background? What was his emotional background? We're looking for any kind of clue that would help us understand what force, what factors, what situations lend themselves to producing such an anomalous fire fatality. We almost got the cooperation, but en route to an interview that was scheduled with the family members, we got a phone call that said, nope, we've changed our mind, don't come. Well, we went anyway, but could not persuade them face to face. So as much as we had hoped to have some information from a very recent case that might help us get some insight into how these fires can be better explained, we fell short. So, we're still looking. These cases will continue to happen. Maybe we'll luck out on the next one.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to touch on fairly recent cases is because I don't want people to get the impression that this is something that came and went. This is something that is still taking place today.
Yes.
And
yes.
We're talking about cases that have already happened, but think of how many cases have just happened. How many cases are just sitting out there waiting for someone like Larry Arnold to come and actually investigate them, to get them out to the public. And I encourage, people that are here in the discussion tonight, as well as others who might be watching later, to, don't sit on this stuff, because there may be a key piece of evidence or a key clue that can help us better understand what is taking place, and more importantly, how to possibly prevent it.
Pull up one of the slides with the death certificates, either for George Mott or for Dr. Bentley, because these death certificates are incredibly revealing and demonstrate just how incredibly difficult it is for a researcher like ourselves to find and identify these cases. Here's the death certificate for George Mott. Now, this is an official document filed in court to declare just how George Mott made his physical transition. Look down there at the green arrows. It says he died by asphyxiation, compounded by smoke inhalation, compounded by fire with advanced charring over several hours. Now, what do you need to determine asphyxiation? You need a trachea, you need lungs, or you need an esophagus. None of those body parts were extant. Clearly, with those body parts not present, you can't determine smoke inhalation. And as far as fire with advanced charring does not define a wholly dehydrated, ashen, powdered corpse. So if we had got this death certificate in our research and read that, we'd say, there's no SHC here. This is a normal third or fourth degree burn injury case. You find the same thing in Dr. Bentley's death certificate. But once again, his official cause of death is asphyxiation compounded by advanced charring with burns to 98% of his, well, it says 90% burning of body. Whereas the deputy coroner, John Deck, told us, I'd say that body was burned by 99%. And it was. A half-hour determination for duration of the blaze, impossible to determine. Was an autopsy performed? The box is checked for yes. But again, as Deputy Coroner Deck told us, how do you autopsy ashes? So death certificates, even though they are supposed to be official, honest reporting of how a death occurred, in cases that fit the definition of SHC, they don't provide a lot of help. And in fact, they're erroneous and misleading.
Have you ever found any evidence to suggest that our own federal government might be interested in this topic?
Oh, wow. What an interesting question. What comes to mind is a flight back from the West Coast where we had done a television show. We were sitting with a gentleman, and conversation eventually led to why we had been in California. And of course, we talked about SHC. And he says, I work for the government. And I've heard about this, and his comments were quite cryptic and rather general, but he led us to believe that parts of our government does know about this phenomenon and quite possibly had done research about it. Now the military, the US Army has developed weaponry that can project sound waves at a distance that will cause intense internal thermal heating of the target, disabling that person. So we have developed, the US government has developed weaponry, I suppose technically, if tuned strongly enough, could actually burn the individual, not just create injurious, debilitating heat injury to that individual. That's as far as we can go. We did contact the FBI through Freedom of Information regarding information for the Reeser case, because ostensibly it was said at the time that remains of Mrs. Reeser had been sent to the FBI lab for analysis. We wanted that information. What we got back was a folder that was incomplete. We know that for a fact, and contained a lot of photographs that, to the best of our ability, have no applicability, no relevance whatsoever to the Reeser fire scene. So things in the government are a little weird when it comes to this subject, and that's about as much as we can say about it.
Have you ever had, since we're on this topic, have you yourself ever been actively told to keep quiet or stop pursuing a particular case?
I think, Justin, you're the first person that ever posed that question to us. Let us ponder that for a moment. At this moment, we don't consciously recall any incident where we have been flat out told to drop the investigation. We were approached several years ago as a potential expert witness to a case that the defense thought was spontaneous combustion, and the prosecution was trying to find an external cause for an insurance settlement. Before we got to appear in court, we were told the case had been settled out of court, so we did not have the opportunity to testify. We don't know what that case was about. That's not quite being told, shut up. Many of our critics would wish that we would shut up and go away, that's for certain. But other than being ushered out of the fire inspector's office in Philadelphia after we showed him the photographs, and he said his response would be, "I could like get drunk and forget about it." We were escorted out of the office, down the elevator, and literally walked to the sidewalk, and the door was shut behind us. That's as close probably as we can currently recall being ostracized or told not to pursue the subject further.
Since we are on the subject of alcohol with some of these cases, including the one in Oklahoma, there's a rare syndrome that some have called auto brewery syndrome, which is like a gut fermentation syndrome, sometimes called drunkenness disease. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but is it possible that some of these subjects may have had this, or like that their system was like, alcohol in some way, and that's what could have led to these flammable conditions? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah. We're not familiar. We're not knowledgeable with that specific incident or that condition. We're trying to look it up and see if we can learn something. Alcohol and SHC was linked in the early history of the topic up until about 1850, when a German scientist, von Liebig, did an experiment with alcohol-soaked tissue, because at that time it was claimed that all victims of SHC were elderly, senile, sedentary, and besotted drunkards. He soaked his burn sample with alcohol, and it would not sustain combustion. Same result that we got in our numerous experiments. And ergo, Liebig said that because his experiments failed, alcohol cannot be a fuel for spontaneous human combustion, and ergo, because we rule out that specific fuel, spontaneous human combustion itself is a non-entity. It's bad scientific reasoning, but he had the reputation and the scientific standing in his day that basically that has become the de facto fallback upon ever since. We have considered alcohol not as an initial fuel per se for SHC, but as a means by which the anatomy or the physiology or the metabolism in certain people's bodies can react with alcohol to break down the water molecule, the hydrogen, oxygen, and hydroxyl ions. If that can happen, then alcohol is a secondary contributor to some cases of SHC. This is von Liebig. Add alcohol, a body, and an external ignition source, and poof, you get ashen bodies. He found that not to be the case, and so, as we've said, he ruled out SHC as anything plausible. We submit that he just used the wrong fuel. If you put water in the tank of a Lamborghini Murcielago, that car isn't going to go anywhere. But if you put the right fuel in the fuel tank, man, you got a hell of a vehicle to play around with. And our submission is von Liebig just chose the wrong fuel and made an erroneous conclusion therefrom.
Let's get really weird here. Like, have there been any of some of the crossover connections into other aspects of Fortean research in these SHC cases?
Yes. We devote a chapter in our book Ablaze to the merging of spontaneous combustion events and what Forteans would generally call UAPs, or back in the day, UFOs, unidentified flying objects. We have a number of cases where people having close encounters with what appears to be alien technology suffer severe burns. Certainly, I'm sure your listeners know about the Cash Landrum case in Texas, but there are other cases far less well known where burns have become quite severe, quite injurious. I'm sure your listeners know about ley lines, the alignment of megalithic sites in England and Europe and elsewhere. That seemed to portend the location of telluric earth energies that can do some weird things at times. Well, what we found in our research, at least for the UK, because we have more cases of unusual fires in the United Kingdom than anywhere else on the planet, we plotted all those cases on a map of the UK and looked for patterns. Now, what we discovered back in 1975 was that many cases of SHC and spontaneous property combustion as well can be linked by straight alignments. Some 84% of the cases in our database at that time could be connected by alignments linking 3, 4, 5, And in one remarkable alignment along the east coast of the United Kingdom, perhaps as many as a dozen cases of anomalous fire phenomena. Now, statistically, that is hugely significant and suggests to us that there are energies in the planet that if a person or property is at a particular spot on one of those alignments at the wrong time, that house, that body, that animal will spontaneously burn.
Oh my gosh. That
It's an interesting theory, and Lord knows you can imagine how much we've taken for that. We've been given for raising that possibility. But in science, if you put forth a theory, you look for evidence to support the theory, to confirm the theory. And what we have found since plotting these alignments in 1975 is that those alignments have led us to two cases, and possibly more, but we'll stake our reputation right now on just two cases that occurred since 1975 or that we did not know about in 1975. But by following those alignments on the road and talking to people, we discovered a classic case that happened in Wales, right on one of those alignments that happened in the memories of January of 1980. Another case that happened in the Lincolnshire area, which is a locus for all kinds of weird Fortean phenomena. A case that when we sat down with the fire brigade commander for Lincolnshire, introduced ourselves and explained why we're there, told him that we'd been led to his area thinking we might find some cases that had not been publicized. Did he know of any? And commander's first response to us was, nope, don't have any cases like that. But then he got really quiet and he pushed the chair back from his desk and leans back into the chair, and sitting beside him, we could just envision the gears going in his brain. He's trying to recall something, and he comes back up, sits up at his desk. He looks at it and says, "No, Larry, a couple years ago, we had this fire. Neighbors hadn't seen the guy for a couple of days. They called us out. We went in the house, didn't find anybody, came back out. The neighbor said, he has to be in there. We haven't seen him outside. He's got to be back in there." This is a tarp paper, literally a tinderbox of an environment. Oiled paper for the windows, stacks of newspapers, whole masses of combustible material in the house. Fire crew goes back in. Can't find him. Come back out. He's got to be in there, they're told. They go in a third time. They find him the third time. What they found was a pile of ash between stacks of newspapers, unburned. And the firemen had literally walked through his ashen remains looking for his body. The body had burned to powder between stacks of unburned newspaper.
that how do you explain that? I mean,
Not by oxidizing combustion, certainly not by the wick effect.
that is unbelievable. All right, so I don't want to forget about this too. The possibility that when you talk about like chi energy, right? And you brought up in some of these cases that were witnessed, they saw this bluish green flame from the abdomen region. That is where chi is believed to be housed, right? Do you think, again, purely speculation, but do you think that there's a connection to the chi?
Excellent question. And the answer is a simple, unequivocal yes. Not for all cases, but for some cases, absolutely. That is a credible theory to pursue. And we have good reason to believe that in some cases, this is exactly the best explanation for what happened to some of these individuals. The reason we say that is in part documented in a chapter in our book about chi, prana, and these quasi-electrical energies that all living beings, we believe, possess. It's part of what makes the person alive. We had the privilege to meet with Gopi Krishna many years ago, face to face. He was a leading proponent of Kundalini as an energy that can broaden, enhance human consciousness. But in his personal experiences, he wrote about a time when the Kundalini in his body, the dual aspects of the Kundalini, had become out of balance. And for him, it created a tremendous amount of heat in his body, he said. with the opportunity to pursue this further with him face to face, he said flat out, had he not the conscious awareness to be able to direct his thinking back into his body and realign the Ida and Pingala aspects of his Kundalini energy, he would have been a case for us to research.
This whole conversation tonight has been absolutely fascinating. And how can people get a hold of you? So anybody who's watching this video later on or listening to this, like, how can they reach out to you?
Easiest thing is to go to our website, parascience.com. Not a great website yet. We're working on getting it upgraded, but that will get you to us, get you introduced to the work that we've done. And there you'll find our email address, and you can use that to email us. We're eager to hear from anybody who's got ideas, suggestions, questions, doubts, open to doubts, or best of all, might have a suggestion as to a lead for a case that we don't yet know about, but would be eager to pursue. As far as getting the book ablaze, you can either go to the website and get in touch with us and get a copy of Ablaze, ta-da, or you can go to Amazon.com and get it through Amazon.
Thank you, my friend. So it's been a pleasure.
Welcome. Thank you, Justin.
We'll have to have you back for a round two. We'll talk about that offline and
Okay.
some other things.
Very
So,
good.
all right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Good night, all.